Man, thou art a wonderful animal, and thy ways past finding out. Thou canst do strange things, but thou turnest them to little account. To conceive of this effort of extraordinary dexterity distracts the imagination and makes admiration breathless. To catch these balls in succession in less than a second of time and deliver them back so as to return with seeming consciousness to the hand again. To make them revolve around him at certain intervals like the planets in their spheres. To do what appears an impossibility, and to do it with all the ease, the grace, the carelessness imaginable, to laugh at, to play with the glittering mockeries. It is skill surmounting difficulty, and beauty triumphing over skill. It makes me ashamed of myself. I ask, what is there that I can do as well as this? Nothing. The utmost I can pretend to is to write a description of what this fellow can do. I have always had this feeling of the inefficacy and slow progress of intellectual compared to mechanical excellence, and it has always made me somewhat dissatisfied. In mechanical efforts you improve by perpetual practice, and you do so infallibly. There is then, in this sort of dexterity, first a gradual aptitude acquired to a given exertion of muscular power from the constant repetition, and in the next place an exact knowledge how much is still wanting and necessary to be supplied. Certain movements and impressions of the hand and eye, having been repeated together an infinite number of times, are unconsciously but unavoidably cemented into closer and closer union. The limbs require little more than to be put in motion for them to follow a regular track with ease and certainty, so that the mere intention of the will acts mathematically, like touching the spring of a machine.
Whenever I think about cricket or about literature or even about history, there's one man who comes to my mind always. That's William Hazlitt. I believe, and I'm glad to notice some other people think so too, that he was the greatest prose writer of his time and one of the great prose writers in English literature. That was for two reasons. He was, first of all, he lived in an age when the sharpness of class conflict, which was introduced by the Industrial Revolution, had not yet overtaken England. And number two, he could write about everything. And he wrote about learning, about history, about painting. He spent many years in Paris trying to be a painter. And he wrote about sports, although he didn't write on cricket, which is a bit surprising because between the day when he was born, 1778, and when he died about 1830, that was the time when the game of cricket as we know it today was formed in all its essentials. But what makes Hazlitt particularly interesting to me is that when I was a boy in the Caribbean, the structure of our society was somewhat similar to the structure of the society in which Hazlitt lived. And I think that on the whole, growing up that way has been of great benefit to me and has enabled me to see the modern world and cricket and a lot of other things in a sort of comprehensive way, which was natural to Hazlitt and in a way was natural to me owing to the kind of life we lived in the Caribbean at the time. Here was I many years ago in Tunapuna, cricket all the time. As a matter of fact, they are playing behind me now. And I suppose in 10 years' time, wherever there is an open space, they will be playing. And I remember being here as a small boy. Somehow the British system had got hold of me, and whether I knew it or not was educating me. I was looking at cricket because I could see the ground from where our house was. I was going to church and listening to what the parson read, and then I would come home and read them in the Bible, and I was living a whole life. My father was a teacher, a very good teacher, highly respected, a man capable in his profession. My mother was this fantastic reader, more than anyone else I have met as a private person. I read the books, then there was the Bible, then I went to school, got into touch. Even before I went to school, I was reading Thackeray, And all together with the cricket and the books and the Bible and everything else, I was what I could call a British intellectual before I was 10 years of age. It happened to me, or it was I had been shaped that way. I don't know what it is, but those are the facts of the case, and I am forcibly reminded of them because they began in Tunapuna, and a lot of them took place here, where I am at the present time. The first thing I noticed was a particular stroke. There was cricket in general and a particular stroke. And to this day, my mind is full of particular innings and particular strokes. And I come back, I walk along, and I see boys playing at the side of the road, and then some little boy makes a stroke. He knows nothing about it, but it's a wonderful stroke that I remember and compared to previous ones. And many of the famous cricketers today have begun that way, and now we are having games in which our boys are traveling all over the world. And when I go down to the press box, I find all sorts of technical arrangements whereby they are giving instantaneous reports to India, to England, and to Australia. And although it has reached so high up, it has never left the roots from which it began.
No chance. Ball coming like a flash to the booth. Right below us to our right for 4 runs. So Fredericks now moves on to 25 on the West Indies after only 40 minutes played. 43.
I was born in Trinidad on the 21st of September 1902, the first son of a cricketing father. I think that apart from the prime necessities, cricket must have been one of the first things that I grasped. It was from the time I knew myself the major recreation, perhaps the most important occupation of our household. My first recollection of the game is myself at 3, with an assortment of corn husks, limes and oranges, rounded stones, and a bat made of a coconut branch, walking up and down the road in front of our house and asking anybody who was passing by to bowl me a ball. But if I could not play because I had no one to play with, I could watch.
101, and then 142, I think, in Barbados, and 130 in the first innings at the Queen's Park Oval, and then was run out for 20 in the second innings. So he really has had a tremendous run so far, and he now is on 12, West Indies 58 for 3, Clive Lloyd not yet off the mark. Beatty has removed one of his short legs to strike the offside field, as he tosses up to Richard, who hits him beautifully. It's going out for the boundary.
There are few more cosmopolitan little places in the world. The British captured Trinidad in 1797. In 1833, Negro slavery was abolished and labor became scarce as a result. East Indian immigration was therefore adopted, and this lasted until 1917. So that today there are over 100,000 East Indians in Trinidad. Chinese have also settled there, so have Portuguese from Madeira and a few Assyrians. Spaniards coming in from Venezuela continually add to the descendants of the old Spaniards, and one has the opportunity of hearing all sorts of languages and seeing at first hand the style and manners of some of the most important races in the world.
When the road is full of yonder, when the road is full of yonder,
I came from the black middle class, but I won one of the island scholarships to Queen's Royal College, a kind of English public school, and all the masters came from Oxford and Cambridge. I went there in 1911 and taught there afterwards for many years as a master, and I really absorbed a great deal, apart from what I read, from the fact that the masters were what they were, and one almost automatically imitated the ideas of people whom I knew first of all as a boy and secondly as a master.
Oswisting, give me the answer you've just given, give it fast. Quid incorpore, Gary Oswisting. Now, give us the answer, not to me, but to all those that are here.
Harry incorporate
No. Harry incorporate Togam Oswald.
although more or less we listened to them in the classroom and they taught us Latin and Greek and advanced mathematics and the way how to behave and we went to cheat, etc., we did what we had to do and we listened to them in a sort of a way, but we really paid inner attention and were dominated by the ideas which were instilled into us on the cricket and football field. What is very effective on me here this morning is that tree there. It was here when I came here in 1911, and as much as anything else in the surroundings, that tree is making itself felt inside of me. The game is very much as I used to play it years ago. The routine, the regularity, the instinctive discipline of the game that has forced itself back on me very strongly here this morning. If I were physically fit, I would go out there and play, ask to be allowed to play with them. Look at them. Nobody shouts, nobody's making any scandalous noises. They are going ahead, and at the end of 6 balls they will change over as if it's a military organization. It is very much as it used to be 60 years ago, and I feel very much at home and in harmony with it. And I know that that has had a lot to do with the way I have grown up and the way I have lived. There is a regularity and routine, a ritual about it. The captain moved you in the field. You listened to what he had to say. You didn't argue about it. Then the umpire gave you out. You accepted it. There was no quarreling about it. If I learned any discipline here, it was in the cricket field because we kept to it instinctively. We had learnt it in books like this, The Captain. And when we were watching, we often had a copy of The Captain near to us, about the boys' own paper circularizing to among us. And these magazines all were governed by the principles which you found in the old ideas of public school behavior. All of them kept to that, and we did that instinctively. We accepted that, we swallowed it down, and we read them all and thought that that was the way to behave. And many of us continued that way. I know I have gone on that way, and I read books by Walcott, I read books by Frank Worrell and read by others and meet them, and I know from the way they behave, the way they talk to me, the way they talk to one another, the way they discuss other people, that those principles are in all of us who had the secondary education in those days.
Ready to resume the struggle with Richards, and Richards is forward defensive. The ball trickles down the wicket. Richards played with admirable restraint, watching the flight of Bedi with circumspection.
Cricket at the Queen's Park Oval, our cricket headquarters, our Mecca, must be linked with cricket in the Savannah. During the first or second week in January every year, even before the Trinidad Turf Club Christmas race meeting had ended, the Queen's Park Savannah became a hive of activity. It is usually a tranquil place. Indeed, its environment ensures this. But a few days afterwards, this quiet would be broken. War clouds would gather on the horizon. Enemy forces of King Willow would mobilize.
On the Savannah, cricket had plunged me into politics long before I was aware of it. When I did turn to politics, I found that I didn't have much to learn. The curious thing was that although the social antagonisms in the island were fought out in the cricket matches very fiercely, yet nobody talked about it. We simply knew that that was going on. And the public that came up to see, they knew also. And I was strongly attracted to the Shannon Club. First of all, I was black, and the Shannon people were black people of some education. And secondly, I was very much attracted by the cricket that St. Hill and Constantine played. I was attracted by their cricket and attracted by them as men. But I had gone to Queen's Royal College. I had made some distinction of myself there. I was a master at acting, and most of the people in Maple had gone to Queen's Royal or St. Mary's. So finally, after some advice, I joined the Maple Club. Well, I went to the Maple Club, and Clifford Roach used to take me into bat with him.
So far as cricket is concerned, he himself was artificially cultivated in that he practiced his cricket before a looking glass. I could see it now. How he didn't break it, the Lord knows. But he'd stand before it, take his cricket books, read out how the stroke was made, practice it without a ball, and go onto the field, make the stroke, but his timing was very often faulty. Stroke, perfect, timing, faulty, wicket, lost. But that didn't stop him from enjoying his game, and we continued playing the game together for many years.
Many famous cricketers have practiced in front of the mirror, and I didn't do so well. Well, it didn't matter. I was very much concerned with how others were doing. And you in particular, I knew you so well. I knew you from the time you were small. And the excitement was not that I used to go in with Clifford. The excitement was that when Clifford met Shannon, they were out to beat us and make us understand that they were better men than we. That is to put it crudely. But Clifford and I were open together against Constantine and Edwin St. Hill, who used to open for the West Indies. So you could imagine me, I would be watching what was equivalent to Test cricket. And my chief business was to make a single and give Clifford the bowling to get away from them. But one thing I have to say, if Constantine bowled a short ball, it was a matter of life and death for me to hook him round. I never dodged that.
For Leary Constantine, cricket made all things possible. And in 1929, he became the first Black League professional at Nelson in Lancashire. The Constantines were watched, central figures on the stage all the time, ambassadors for Trinidad and the coloured races. In their fourth summer, 1932, the household took in a lodger. C.L.R. James cannot have been the easiest of guests in a four-roomed house with no garden and a lively 4-year-old child. He was a Trinidadian with ambitions to write and some abilities as a cricketer. He kept late hours, read intensely, and was deeply interested in politics.
I came to Nelson because Constantine had told me in Trinidad that if I wanted to come to England to write and I hadn't enough money, come on, and if I didn't do so as well as I should, I could come to live with him. Well, my money disappeared in 3 months, so I told him, Larry, I have no money. He says, come up here. And I came to Nelson and stayed here. Now, it had a remarkable influence on my life and on his, because Nelson was a place that was loaded with all sorts of advanced politics. And the whole political atmosphere in England and Nelson made me very much aware of actual concrete politics, not merely wishing, but doing something about it if I could. And Larry had similar ideas. But one thing I must say for him, he said, I am here to play cricket and I will have nothing to say about your cricket. But I would go about and they would ask him to speak, and then he would tell me, come along, and I would go, and they would ask me if I would say a few words, and I would look at him and he would say, go ahead, I would say a few words. He said nothing. What I remember he would laugh a lot at some of the things I said, because I believe he would have liked to say them, but he knew that he wasn't going to do that, not while he was playing cricket. I wouldn't be surprised if I got into politics here and began to see, as a newly bred Marxist, politics from a more international point of view. And we concentrated on Africa, Padmore and the rest of us. Constantine remained a West Indian, 100% West Indian. And he was interested in what we were doing, but he was, in a very precise sense, more West Indian than I was. When I got into it, my mind was generally for the world revolution, and chiefly Africa as well as Europe.
Did it affect your cricket much, and the way in which you viewed cricket?
It did. I came here and began to see cricket for what it was, a part of the society. It had been much more of a part of the society in the Caribbean than it was, but I hadn't thought of it as such. But in England, I began to understand a lot of things, and as time passed on, much of my cricket experience in the Caribbean acquired historical and logical shape and form in Britain here.
Where have you been this last few years in America? Jim thought you were a cowboy straight from Texas with your hat.
I am an illegitimate brother of Mr. President Johnson.
You've still got the same old roller what we had when you was here.
You remember the roller? We got that roller. We can only trace it back as far as 1923, and it's still running perfectly. Remember the big heavy roller? We're wondering whether that Duke down south that buys all these old cars might make us a big offer so we could buy a new one with it.
What do you want to buy a new one for?
Were you writing a lot then? That was your main profession, writing?
Writing?
I used to remember you speaking on that box by the old...
yes, but I used to do a lot for the Manchester Guardian.
A little to the left, would I describe you?
I should think somewhat more than
Have you matured, or shall I say, mellowed since those days?
I have developed.
You wouldn't, I would say mellowed, like we all do.
No,
I mean, there's 1, 2, 3, 4.
I would say
5 old chaps here, and I'm the youngest, by the way. Although I say it myself, and there's a few here. It was a damn good amateur side with a first-class profession. Leary was so keen, he got everybody else exceptionally keen, and then with a wonderful balanced side. This was the beauty of it to me.
Nelson won the league 7 times out of 9 or something.
Our chairman then, Mr. Tom Morgan, I think was the first to get in touch, get the idea of getting Constantine to come here. And they went to Manchester in the first place. And from then on, there was no negotiation going on all the time until he signed in 29. When he came to Nelson, he was the only black man
there was
in
no
Nelson.
coloured person.
Everybody looked at him whether they were cricket enthusiasts or not, and he felt it.
I would say they were more inquisitive rather than...
It was.
And I think Leary took that the wrong way once or twice.
He did.
That was my honest opinion.
Well, I was here in 33, and I used to come up and down, and after a time, well, nothing used to go. Oh, look at that was a fine stroke.
Well, to say the same thing.
Milburn's at that end.
Yeah, Milburn made the stroke. There was something about the West Indian Saturday game that the English players, dominated by the county cricket mentality, had lost. What Leary did in 28, he brought that in, and he was quite at home in the one-day game.
Yes, he was very much at home.
Very much at home. And he was such an all-rounder, bowler, batsman, fielding. So whenever he was on the field, you had to watch him.
Leary was very fast and very hostile and very sensible. If he hit somebody, he didn't stand like Truman, stick him up or knock, he went to rub it. But the next bloody ball was just as bad, you know, he was hostile.
When people like Sidney Barnes came here, there was, in addition to the game, there was what would Leary do with them and what would they do with him. It was like in a baseball game when a batsman come in and a spread pitcher is there too. That used to happen. So in addition to the general competence of the game, there was something very concerned about what he would do and what the others would do with him, because a bowler who came here wanted to get him out, and Leary knew that.
Sidney Barnes is generally admitted to be the greatest bowler cricket has yet seen. I had a glimpse of him the other day in action. When Constantine came in, I looked for a duel. Constantine was not going to be drawn into playing forward. Barnes was not going to bowl short, to be hooked over the pavilion, or over pitch to be hit into the football field. Constantine also was not going to chance it, for on that turning wicket to such accurate bowling, he who chanced it was lost. Barnes bowled a slow one that might almost be called short. Constantine shaped for the forcing backstroke, but even as he raised himself for the stroke, he held his hand, and wisely. The ball popped up and turned many inches. Another ball or two, and again Barnes dropped another on the same spot. It was a sore temptation. Constantine shaped again for his stroke, his own stroke, and again he held his hand, wisely. Was this recitative suddenly to burst into the melody of fours and sixes to all parts of the field? In the years to come, it will be something to say that we have seen him.
I didn't know anybody, I didn't know whom to send it to, so I showed it to Constantine, and he said, send that article to Neville Cardus and tell him that I told you to send it to him. So I sent off the article to Neville Cardus, Manchester Guardian, Manchester, and next thing I get a letter from Cardus telling me to come to see him whenever I come into Manchester. So I go in a day or two, and Cardus tells me, now I am looking for someone to help me to do some work at matches that I am not able to do. Will you do it? I told him, most certainly I will do it. And after a minute or two of casual conversation, I went away, and that's the way he told me, come and see him when the next season began. And I went and saw him, and we worked out together. In my opinion, he made the cricket writer somebody who wrote about cricket not as a report of statistics, but of something that was interesting to the general public as literature. I believe he's unique as a writer. He was very much interested in the character of the men who played, not in their personal characters at home, but in the way that they played expressed their character, and he thought that cricket offered an exceptional opportunity for a number of people to display their personal characteristics in public for everybody to see. He was interested in the crowd. He would know what the response of the crowd was. He would refer to it. But in reality, he was concerned with the kind of men who were out there and what they were doing. For him, it was an artistic experience to see the men playing cricket and playing the game technically and expressing their personal characteristics. Carter stands first above everybody else. There's no question about that.
No writer of novels could make a picture of Yorkshire life half as full of meaning as the one drawn every year in matches between Lancashire and Yorkshire. Fours or no fours, runs or no runs, the games touched greatness because of the North of England character that was exposed in every action, every movement all day. The joke about Yorkshire cricket is that for Yorkshiremen it's no laughing matter. It's a possession of the clan and must on no account be put down or interfered with by anybody not born in the county.
I was concerned with the crowd, with the mass of the population politically, with the result that as my political ideas developed and more I began to see that it was what people felt and not what distinguished persons were doing, that mattered. That has grown steadily in my view of the world. And I would see 30,000 people watching a match, and you could see them day after day. And by degrees, I began to see them as people who mattered, who came forth to see something. And what they came to see made me watch cricket more closely, and bit by bit I developed my ideas on the subject. I used to say the only society I really would have liked to live in, I'd liked the Greek society. I'd visited Greece, and I had seen where they used to meet to discuss their politics, the people from the city. Then they were the people who invented the tragic drama. They had the Olympic Games, and they used to meet and discuss their business democratically. So those three things made me feel that those were the people I could have lived with. If I had gone there, I would have been probably very unhappy, but in my head I could say, tragic drama, Olympic Games, and democratic discussion of all problems by all the people in the city. And from that, I began to make a connection between the development of democracy, the democratic idea in Britain, that became the 60s, 1848, there was some, but 1860, 1870, the development of the democratic idea, and at the same time the development of people coming to see cricket matches. I should say between 1850 and 1900, what was noticeable in the development of English social life was, number one, the development of the democratic process, and number two, they led the world in regard to the public interest in popular games. Those two mattered to me. I don't say those were the only two, but they mattered very much to me.
It soon becomes possible to guess within a few years the date of any team photograph, not only by the style of dress, but by the poses and increasing discipline of the grouping. Through these photographs, we can read the change in the whole status of sport that has taken place since the 1860s. Before that date, there hadn't been many teams or champions to be photographed. There was not only no Wimbledon, but as yet no game of lawn tennis at all. It wasn't invented until the 1870s, the same decade that saw the beginnings of Test cricket and the county championship, the main football competitions, and the Open Golf tournament. In fact, we can see photography and organised sport together as two strands in the extraordinary history of 19th century England, where so many of the institutions we take for granted today developed roughly in parallel, all reinforcing one another. Things like railways and education and public health and democratic voting and trade unions and photography and sport. As people packed into cities and endured the impoverished daily life of an industrial society, there were intense pressures to develop popular versions of those freedoms that were hitherto the privilege of the rich. Sport became a key element in a society characterized by organization and rational competition. In the 1860s, it became necessary for the first time to raise football above its many local variants and establish uniform rules, and the game split into the rival codes of rugby and association. The FA Cup was started on the model of the knockout house competition at Harrow. It was at first won by sides from the public schools, but the victory of Blackburn Olympic in 1883 symbolised the takeover of the game by the people. Among the All England 11 of 1847 is a private schoolmaster called Nicholas Wannerstrocht. He played, however, under the pseudonym of Felix, since when he started his career in the 20s, parents might have regarded the game of cricket, which was still associated with gambling, as a disreputable and frivolous activity for their son's teacher. 30 years later, fee-paying parents would have been more likely to object to a staff that didn't contain a first-class player to inspire and coach his pupils. In this period, sport became respectable and available to all as spectators, if not as players, and a multitude of organizations grew up to promote it. One book became the Bible of this whole movement, Tom Brown's School Days. Thomas Hughes was at Rugby under its great reforming headmaster, Thomas Arnold. In the first part of the book, he celebrates the traditional sports of the country, as played at its feasts or seasonal festivals. But Tom Brown then goes to Rugby and is immersed in regular cricket and football.
He was very clear. He was not a great writer, but he had a very sharp mind. And I read the book when I was about 8, Tom Brown's School Days, and I'm reading it up to today. A few months ago, I read the book again. And as I grew to, I loved the book for what it said about the games that I was interested in. But then later, I began to see that Hughes had understood that England had become an industrial country, but he had a great liking for the games of the village whist, and he had them to a degree that nobody else had. I think Hughes was concerned not so much with the value of cricket, but with the principles that permeated the game by that time, and which had permeated the game. I am trying to emphasize this, that Dr. Arnold's ideas, which he was trying to instill into behavior, were things that were not easy for scholarship to incorporate, but on the cricket field and football field, and Hughes was very much aware of this, there they were of great value and were important.
"Oh, Brown, can't I go in next?" shouted the swiper. "Whose name is next on the list?" said the captain. "Oh, do let the swiper go in," chorused the boys. Tom yielded, against his better judgment. "I dare say now I've lost this match by this nonsense," he said. "Come now, none of your irony, Brown," answered the master. "I'm beginning to understand this game scientifically. What a noble game it is, too." "Isn't it, sir? But it's more than a game. It's an institution," said Tom. "Yes," said Arthur, "the birthright of British boys, old and young, as habeas corpus and trial by jury are of British men. The discipline and reliance on one another which it teaches is so valuable, I think," went on the master. "It ought to be such an unselfish game. It merges the individual in the 11. He doesn't play that he may win, but that his side may." "That's very true," said Tom, "and that's why football and cricket, now one comes to think of it, are such much better games than fives or hare and hounds or any of the others, where the object is to come first or to win for oneself, and not that one side may win." "And then the captain of the 11, said the master. "What a post is his in our school world. Almost as hard as the doctor's, requiring skill and gentleness and firmness, and I know not what other rare qualities." "What a sight it is," broke in the master, "the doctor as a ruler. Perhaps ours is the only little corner of the British Empire which is thoroughly, wisely, and strongly ruled just now. I'm more and more thankful every day of my life that I came here to be under him." "So am I, I'm sure," said Tom, "and more sorry that I've got to leave."
Dr. Arnold is a man whom it is not too easy to understand today unless you understand what he was trying to do. Personally, he was a man who was interested in religion, and above all, he was interested in principled behavior by persons who had social authority. They had to be aware that what they were doing was for the benefit of society as a whole and the improvement of religion and morality. Later in his life, he got very interested in learning and in the study of the development of the intellect. But what is fantastic, the British middle class and those members of the aristocracy who realized that a change was necessary took from him his interest in religion, his concern for moral behavior and principled conduct, but they were not interested particularly in his intellectual ideas. They dropped that. All the doctor's ideas became part of cricket and football, although he himself was not interested in them. And I think him more important than Carlyle and Ruskin for this reason. They wrote and told people what to do. Arnold did more than that. He actually educated people in his school, and he was so successful that all over England the public schools began to follow what Dr. Arnold was doing. In other words, he was not only a theorist, but he was a politician, a practical man who did certain work which had an enormous effect on England, the industrialization of England, and the steadiness with which the British ruling class governed England and the principles which they instilled.
Imperial cricket shows how the English have introduced their national game into every quarter of the globe, from China to the west coast of Africa, from Hong Kong to the West Indies, from from Melbourne to Mysore, the game is played wherever a pitch can be procured and two teams got together. At a period when the great national pastime of more or less continual internecine warfare has, under the British Raj, fortunately been relegated more nearly to its proper place in the relations of mankind, it is not a thing without national advantages if the love of cricket, from Raja downwards, leads the natives of India to develop the moral and physical qualities of endurance and self-restraint, of perseverance and comradeship, which the practice of that game almost unconsciously teaches. Men need some incentive to keep themselves fit, and much training ere they can school themselves to endure the chagrin of personal failure or disappointment. This incentive and that training are furnished by the love of cricket as by hardly any other of the arts of peace, short of boxing.
Did you know all about the Lord's Pavilion when you were a boy in the West Indies?
I didn't know much about it, but I had read Ranjit Singhi's book, I had read P.F. Warner's book, I read, when I was a boy in the West Indies, while I was still at Queen's Royal College, I was aware that the pavilion had some historic ideas behind it. I had read that Albert Trott had hit a ball over it, and that Ranjit Singhi, somewhere or other, would be sitting shivering in the early summer in warm clothes, and they would take it off for him to go out and he would make a century. All that I had read and connected these things with the pavilion. You cannot read about cricket without Lord's Pavilion and the men who made it, and when they brought the turf from here and elsewhere and then built the pavilion. It is part of England and part of not only English cricket but part of London.
Many of the people whose images preside here, either visually or in spirit, would probably be defined as conservative and even reactionary or Philistine figures in a wider cultural context. Has that ever worried you, that you are interested in the same things?
Not particularly. It hasn't worried me at all, because cricket is a game that all people in England at one time were interested in. And I was interested to English cricket in the north of England, where they played the league, Nelson and the rest of them, where the ordinary workers from the mill would come in on a Saturday morning at 11 o'clock, and cricket was Larry Constantine and his friends. There was not the slightest taint of aristocracy or superiority there. So I could tell that, and then I could see county cricket and could see the difference between, but nevertheless, the people who had taught us the game in the Caribbean were the aristocratic planters. Constantine had a tremendous respect and liking for H.B.G. Austin. So did I. He had brought people there and brought teams to England, had organized them, and that's how we had lived. And when I know how much we, the descendants of slaves in the Caribbean, just drifting along, picked up cricket and started to play long before we got interested in football. And I know that he, H.B.G. Austin, H.B.G. Austin's brother and the rest of them, they brought the game. I am quite, I respect them at any rate. I have no hostility.
Another figure whose image and whose spirit presides over Lords is W.G. Grace. Was he always a very potent figure in your imagination?
He was always a potent figure in my imagination as a cricketer and as a man who had made the centuries and so forth. But years passed, and I began to think of cricket as a historical part of a social development. And by degrees, I got it into my head that W.G. Grace had played a tremendous role in the Britain that we have today. And without him, the game would never have been what it became. So that I insist, looking at it, that he brought some of the old England and forced a place for it in the New England. And the people came to see because they were looking at something that they had inside of them. And therefore, Grace is a historical figure.
Was it a marvelous accident that somebody like him arose when he did?
I don't know. I wouldn't call it an accident. I don't think a thing like that is an accident. It is clear that he filled a certain need, and that a certain man fills a certain need. You can call Shakespeare an accident, or Balzac an accident, or Michelangelo an accident, but something is required, and they do it.
Any cricketer who thinks for a moment can see the enormous change WG introduced into the game. I hold him to be not only the finest player, born or unborn, but the maker of modern batting. He turned the old one-stringed instrument into a many-chorded lyre, and in addition, he made his execution equal his invention. Where a great man has led, many can go afterwards, but the honor is his who found and cut the path.
And did he appeal equally, do you think, to all classes?
I believe, I complain in my book that he was the best known man in England at the time. And I remember as a small boy in the West Indies, when I would be reading, my father knew about, I was reading about cricket. I knew much more about cricket than he did, but I would ask him things. And he knew about W.G. Grace, and he knew about Ranjit Singhji. He knew nothing else. But we all, everybody in the West Indies knew the old man and his beard and the 100 centuries and the fact that he had lasted so long. I don't believe there is any place where English education and English books have been read and talked about that people don't know W.G. Grace up to today. I am very much struck that Mrs. Grace, living in the country, writes to the man who is leading the All England 11 and say, I would recommend to you my son, and I have a son, W.G., who is going to be the best of them because that boy's back play is sound. That to me is very West Indian, although it wouldn't be the mother in that case, but it would be a father.
Could you imagine W.G. Grace as having been a reading man, a cultured man?
I couldn't imagine that. I think he was the kind of English country gentleman of the late 19th and early 20th century. The English country doctor, a man of some education, but doing a job, but not concerned with literature in the way that Hazlitt and Jane Austen and these were. He wasn't that type. And that's why he was able, with this magnificent physique he had and the opportunities at the game, he was able to put everything he had into it because he wasn't bothered about other things. He wasn't aware that he ought to have been reading literature or so. He wasn't. And that, I believe, helps many of the Caribbeans in the old days. To play cricket for them was really to assume something which lifted them from the ordinary people without having to come abroad or to pass Cambridge examinations. And I am very much opposed to the separation of games from what the people call the higher culture.
In your book, you make a comparison between the experience of international cricket and the experience of tragic drama in ancient Greece. How do you see that comparison?
I visited Greece in 1954, I think, and I naturally had been soaked in the Greek drama, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, but then I saw for the first time where they used to play them. I spent many hours at Epidaurus watching the Greek. The tragic drama in ancient Greece, I was familiar with it from reading books. I had never seen any performance and realized that what used to take place was 30,000 people from the Greek city. They went for 3 or 4 days. There was a competition. Everybody sat around from dawn till late in the evening watching the tragic drama. but the tension and the great support of all the people around and the general ritualistic aspect of the Greek drama and the ritualistic aspect of a cricket match all came home very forcibly to me. That was because I believe I had so much cricket in my head. So it was very simple for when I saw the Greek theatre and realized what used to go on to think immediately of cricket. A lot of other people wouldn't have done it, but I did, being who I am.
If it were the time, Anacharsis, for the Olympian or the Isthmian or the Panathinaik Games, by seeing what takes place there, you would be able to appreciate that we are quite justified in expending so much ardour on these spectacles. I cannot find words to give you an idea of the pleasure that you would have if you were seated in the middle of the anxious spectators, watching the courage of the athletes, the beauty of their bodies, their splendid poses, their extraordinary suppleness, their tireless energy, their audacity, their sense of competition, their unconquerable courage, their unceasing efforts to win a victory. I am sure that you would not cease to overwhelm them with praise, to shout again and again, and to applaud.
Your really great bowler has his greatness in his head, and he knows when he has to deliver a ball of a certain length on a certain wicket against a certain batsman at a certain stage in the game.
Bowling, good ball. It came back from outside off stump. That's really good bowling from Andy Roberts. A fine over this.
A batsman, while he's batting, he not only represents the side, he is his whole side. At the same time, the bowler bowls, and after 6 balls, he's taken off and somebody else puts on.
Magnificent hook shot out of the ground. Superb shot there by Lloyd, the West Indian batsman.
So that you have a very complicated relation between the whole and the part, between the universal and the individual, so to speak. It may take a long time, but every single ball means that the whole game or stage of the game is there involved.
Tragedy for Australia. Absolute tragedy with a misfield there. The old rule of never run on a misfield.
Sober started the day with 7 overs, 3 maidens, no wicket for 18. He's now got 15 overs, 8 maidens, 1 for 23. That can't be too far away.
The complicated structure of the game is best expressed by looking carefully at what happens to the batsman, and particularly the great batsman who represents his side. When he is batting and batting well, the whole game revolves around him. The fieldsmen, the bowlers, the captain and the spectators. He is the center of a tremendous complicated body of interest that are concerned with him as the center.
Another beautiful straight drive. Beats Fletcher, goes through for 4. Brings up the 400. What a wonderful shot from Gary Sobers.
It was no accidental quirk, but a symbolic comment harbouring a profound and biting irony that prompted the architect of the new grandstand at Lord's to crown it with his own immortal flourish, the dim figure of Father Time. In front of him and below him, the figures blink and change, blink and change. To the superficial sight, the changeless game, simple and elaborate, white against green, goes on forever in its unruffled harmony. And we, the spectators, spanning contentedly our 4 generations of cricketers, watching George Hurst pass, and Hobbs pass, and Sutcliffe pass, and Hammond pass, absorb the comfortable illusion that they alone, the unwavering eyes, are changeless entirely and will remain. While all the day and night, Father Time moves to and fro on his roof. He may not have all the answers, but he has the laugh on us. So the moments, one after the other, go, and in desperation I try sometimes to nail them on the wing. They're nearly all gone. Their moment, in cricket and in time, has been marked off into the past. But because their moment, though they could not have known it, enriched forever a moment of my own, Then that moment in time has been, and can always be, carried from the past into the present, and from there indefinitely into the future. The clock will not stop, I know. Father Time, swinging sardonically over Lords, still bends to the removal of the fatal bale. But there are moments that can cheat the clock and can cheat time, for a moment or two at any rate. And here below, that is all we can ask or need.
I see in that photograph all that Headley was, that complete control, the ease, the confidence and the certainty. You have to know the man well to see all that in a picture, but I can see it, and the very best that there is in West Indian batting. Here is another man. That is Weeks. A man came to Lord's one day and he saw a batsman make a stroke just as he came in. He says, but for God's sake, that is Everton Weeks, and it was Everton. Everton had come here not with a West Indian team, but to spend some time, and they had put him in the match. And this fellow saw the stroke, and he said immediately, that is Everton Weeks, and there you can see the kind of thing. You see where his toes are, and the balance and the way the batter swung back. That is very typical of Everton and very typical of the West Indies also. That's Clyde Walcott, who was either on the front foot or the back foot. Bowlers will tell you. He was a ferocious batsman. He could come forward and murder mid-off swingers and get back and murder the same mid-off swingers. That was a ferocious man to play against. And Worrell came from the old game and learned what was new and was symptomatic of the new West Indies. The battle to make him the captain was the feeling that we had reached a stage where one of us should be in charge. And Worrell made the team, and so was the result of all that Worrell did. The West Indies Islands are so small, and we have so little to go by, that when somebody comes up, especially a young black man, and shows that he has some credit in him, all the people begin to say, well, here is another one. He's one who will make a century at Lord's or the Oval. They have told me that. And not only do they say that about him, but he himself begins to feel that he has immense possibilities that he hasn't got in law, that he wouldn't have had in medicine, he wouldn't have had in business, but in cricket, that field is open, and as a writer, the field was open too if he came to Britain. My book was dedicated to W.G. Grace and Larry Constantine and later to Frank Worrell. But then I wrote a preface and I made it clear that many of the ideas that I was writing I had brought with me from the Caribbean in a general way. But it was only living in England with the historical background of England and the wide scope of British cricket that I was able to make the thing historically clear. But that in general, and I put that in the preface, Caliban, by which I meant myself and Frank Worrell and George Lamming and the rest of us, in order to find out his character, after 300 years of slavery and subordination, has to venture into fields that Caesar never knew. We had to find out things about society in general in order to place ourselves that it had never been necessary for Caesar, those who had been in charge of us, had never been able to find out. And that's what I think is in Beyond the Boundary and why the book is so well received by many of them. They realize I have said things which they hadn't thought about. And I believe that I said those things because of circumstances I have explained, and West Indians had to find something new in order to establish that the West Indians had arrived as competent members of modern society.